Thank you everybody for joining us today for our closing talk of this year-long series, Design History Now. And I wanted to take just a kind of brief moment to place Mahmoud's talk in the context of the series. We set out last January to explore design history as a practice, and we emphasized that we were interested in exploring with our audience what the practice of design history encompasses, but more importantly, what could it encompass now and in the future. We were particularly keen to think about approaches to design history that might challenge or offer alternative approaches to an otherwise common focus of design history on individual famous designers, a particular set of institutions, and a fairly narrow common canon. So we offered a kind of provocation at the beginning to think about design as a consequence. And what we meant by this was to think of design as a consequence of its context, as well as a player in the creation of objects and ideas. And we suggested that understanding design as a consequence would necessarily sometimes be less celebratory in nature, because it pushes us to question the power of design in favor of the factors that create design and designers. But in doing so, we believe it connects design history to larger issues that are still deeply important to us today. Things like production and labor, or language and technology. These are areas in which design, which is still often referred to as a problem-solving discipline, has yet to solve. In that sense, the thrust of the series was a call for more holistic, more inclusive, and sometimes more difficult histories of design. But this approach, we argued, had the potential to be more relevant to more people. Holistic, inclusive, and difficult design histories help position design in relation to issues of the present, and they prompt us to think about the larger purpose of the work that we're doing. And I think it's this that is really at the root of the series, to gather together a group of practitioners and scholars who are thinking deeply about what they're doing and why. Sometimes this has been explicit in some of the talks, and sometimes it's been more implicit. And I hope that the conversations across talks, the connections, the contradictions, the questions raised, contribute to a space of more critical design discourse. So on to today's talk. For anyone who's familiar with Mahmoud's work, it will come as no surprise that we both referred to his work in our note at the beginning of the series and asked him to speak today as we conclude. Mahmoud Shabazz is an associate professor of cultural anthropology at Uppsala University, Sweden. He is author of The Design Politics of the Passport that we mentioned in our introduction a year back, Materiality, Immobility, and Dissent, and is co-editor of Seeing Like a Smuggler, Borders from Below. He's also a founding member of the Decolonizing Design Group. After Mahmoud's talk, Rukmini Swaminathan will kick off our discussion. Rukmini is a PhD student in the Department of History at the University of Michigan. Her research interests lie in bringing together the history of public housing in India with the history of interiors, furnishing, and middle-class consumption. Rukmini worked on the initial conceptualizing of the series, and so we're really delighted to have her back as we conclude today. So I'll hand over to Mahmoud. Thank you.
Thank you, Nia, for inviting me. Welcome, everyone. And thank you, Rukmini, for agreeing to also listen to me a bit more carefully and raise some questions. Yeah, it's great to be able to talk to you across all these borders and perhaps and hopefully find synergies and relations in the ways we think about the world and the catastrophes we face today in different parts of the world. Catastrophes that are also not less so configured and related to by designers. And that's the talk I would talk today the most about, while my previous work has focused a lot on concrete artifacts of mobility and kind of how histories of these documents intersect that different categories of difference, such as race, gender, and class, and how histories of making, histories of materialities need always to be considered in relation to these categories and how they enforce each other. So today I would kind of more present, could say, a theoretical intervention about what we often refer or think about as humanitarian design. But the foundation of this type, nonetheless, is very much similar to those ideas that theoretically I discovered. I kind of explored in my first book, The Design Politics of the Passport, this whole idea of how design and politics reinforce each other. Today, I will talk about design as a colonial imaginary of humanitarian goods. And you will notice that I would talk about goods in two meaning of the terms, the good as things and objects and things that we consume or utilize in our everyday life to do some function, but also good in the sense of moral good. And this is where I'm going to focus a lot in this, how morality gets materialized into this type of objects. So the histories of humanitarianism are not only the histories of national and international organizations, aid workers and politicians, who all eagerly argue for protecting a universal idea of humanity. These histories of humanitarianism, are also histories of spaces, objects, vehicles, infrastructures, and technologies that both have facilitated humanitarian work and, more importantly, have shaped humanitarianism into a permanent mode of acting and being in the world. The question of how humanitarianism makes the emergency condition into a permanent mode of life has been frequently addressed by many scholars of anthropology of humanitarianism in recent decades. However, these permanent temporaries are derived from forces of material practices that render a site in need of a specific relief. Once the spatial, digital, or physical product oriented towards that relief, and when the relief is delivered, then urgency and the political condition leading to the emergency disappears. What kind of magic is this, that once a solution is materialized, the politics and histories that have shaped the problem disappears from the site? This magic is called design. Designing has always been part of humanitarian endeavors, but it's only in recent decades that design community has been proactive in claiming a relevance in humanitarian work and has pushed its skill and knowledge for problem solving as the necessary qualities missing from the work of humanitarianism. This, combined with escalation in technological solutions to problems of the century, has led to the situation where there are many architects, product designers, digital designers, and developers, as well as those who work with approaches such as design thinking, service design, and participatory design, have discursively and practically occupied a professional space that is called humanitarian design. Humanitarian design is a professional field of designing, where designers collaborate with or are commissioned by humanitarian sectors to engage with the process of designing products, services, or systems for populations affected by different disasters. Humanitarian designers often refer to their work as designerly approaches that assist crisis-affected people in reaching a situation in which they can live with dignity. This is no longer a bottom-up initiative coming from the side of the concerned designers ready to apply their skill and knowledge for the good of humanity, as, for example, advocated by Viktor Papanek in the 60s. Humanitarian design today has institutionally become an organizing discourse around possible and permanent solutions for problems to which humanitarian aid is seemingly a temporary and inadequate remedy. The UN High Commissioner on Refugees, UNHCR, as we often refer to, Innovation Office, their Innovation Office, is one strong actor in this sphere, and it is within such a discursive field that abstract words and universal assumptions such as compassion, resilience, dignity, and empathy are frequently deployed by humanitarian designers in their work to argue how designing as a value-oriented activity can be an asset to humanitarian aid, as designers concretely work to materialize and deliver those values for all human beings in a universal fashion. Besides those voices promoting and amplifying humanitarian design practices within national and international spaces of disaster, emergency, and post-disaster reconstructions, humanitarian design has been previously critiqued as a form of new imperialism, as by Bruce Nussbaum, or a driving force in neoliberal restructuring of poor communities, as Cedric Johnson has argued, or reproducing the violence of borders by ignoring the border politics, which I myself worked on, or what Mirka Madiano called the techno-colonialism. Others have taken a more cautious approach and have discussed it as possible forms of engagement in the intersection of aid development and problem solving, for which its effects and ambitious promises should be assessed carefully and critically within its own limited capacity and the context of operation. So there are groups of scholars who oppose these critiques that I just listed and say, look, we should not expect too much of humanitarian design. They are limited, they are not supposed to solve any political problems, they are just to be used for that specific condition. While having different perspectives on what effects humanitarian design has in the world and on the populations it addresses, these strands of scholarship have one thing in common: that humanitarian design is not only about products and objects, such as solar radios, food packages, drinking devices, or water pumps, nor only spaces such as shelters, hospitals, and schools, but also financial services, social innovations, communication infrastructures, and community development. This means that humanitarian design is a complex network of physical, digital, spatial, and temporal materials and materialities, with great variation in scales and outreach that are deeply enmeshed with economies of development, idea of entrepreneurial self, and financialization of lives. In the times of economization of life, all aspects of life, it's no surprise that the lives of many, and particularly the vulnerable, can be turned into the subjects of innovation and design intervention, which have always been part and parcel of capitalist economies. Indeed, modern design, being inherently a capitalist mode of value generation, has always claimed the position of addressing life as a universal whole, without much consideration of design's economic origin in the division of labor. And that claim continues even today in the most critical and self-claimed radical forms of design scholarship and practice. In this talk, I will look at how design imaginaries of addressing the world and its complexities as problems to be solved by design's capacity indeed overlap with humanitarian imaginaries of specific places and times in need of creative interventions, emergency helps, temporary solutions, and aid. And I call this overlapping space the colonial imaginary of humanitarian goods, where politics of justice is reduced to good as a universal quality of humanity, and here we should ask, what human? Acquired through material goods. So that's where these two category of goods and meaning of the term goods overlap. I will first discuss the dominant paradigm within the Western design thinking and practice, commercial and critical alike, as a design imaginary of problem solving that assumes a right to intervene in places seen as deprived of problem solving capacities. So again, I will discuss the dominant paradigm within Western design thinking today and practice, both commercial and critical. It's easier to always critique the commercial one and less easier to critique the academic critical ones. So I see them as a design imaginary of problem solving that assumes a right to intervene in places seen as deprived of problem solving capacity. Then I will discuss the humanitarian imaginary of design as a white social imaginary where a racial order is reinforced. That is, a creative white middle class who at worst designs for and at best designs with the non-white poor in need of creativity. At the end, I bring these two discussions together to argue how designing within a humanitarian context is part and parcel of a colonial understanding of the world, where the Western human and its needs and desires function as a model for how the rest of the world can be imagined, organized, and even empathized with. I will conclude with a suggestion on what kind of politics and practices designers need to pay attention to in these contexts and situations in order to join other imaginative politics in times of disaster capitalism configured by a militarized global apartheid, to borrow Catherine Westermann's powerful figuration. The design imagery of problem solving. Design practices today see the world and its complexities as problems that can be solved by designing. This logic, which has long dominated Western design discourses and has been exported to other parts of the world, has been shaped discursively by 60s and 70s problem-solving literature in cybernetic and artificial intelligence. Herbert Simon, whose book, The Science of the Artificial, is a frequent in design theory literature, has been inspirational for what many active designers today imagine to be their task, problem solving. The rationalization at work for constructing, modeling, and structuring problems and solutions has been critiqued and reformulated as, for instance, situated problems. Some people call it situated problems like Terry Winogard and Flores and Lucy Sussman. And these critiques have unsettled the constructed binaries in cybernetic literature, such as ill-structured problems versus well-structured problems, or tame problems versus wicked problems. And these critiques have tried to say that we cannot have a binary between these two types of problems. What they argue, this is that a rationalized science of designing, which appears as a remedy to wicked problems or ill-structured problems, need to be questioned. These critics have argued that problems do not exist as a separate entity somewhere in the world. They are infused with social constructions in which solutions are seen as remedies to a solvable problem. They do not arrive in an isolated package to receive solutions. So these problems just don't come to us and say, okay, now the solutions, it's here. We designers give us solutions. These problems, they're just there. For example, the problem of sheltering in an emergency situation is not just a factual truth of not having a shelter that directly comes to a designer's studio for solution. The problem is already understood through the ways in which hegemonic ideas about shelter and what counts as a good, standard, and dignified shelter in relation to costs, materials, logistics, and aesthetic norms are played out in the design process. As such, designing is a constant reworking of problem solution rather than a linear process from problem to solutions. So this is what the critiques of problem solving task or the critiques of widget problems often take up. Yet, it is striking that these critiques have stayed within the same framework, still arguing for designing as an activity in the world that reworks problems and solutions. It is no surprise that later approaches such as social innovation, which dominates design education and practice today, almost globally, I could say, have followed the same logic. For instance, Ezio Manzini's work on social innovation, which has been influential for many designers and design researchers within humanitarian design, argues for sense-making in addition to problem-solving. From such a perspective, different situations, contexts, and relations can be rendered issues in need of designers' interventions. In all this theorization, critical scholars and commercial practitioners have equally produced an imaginary in which designers somehow embody a form of distinct expertise that can understand a context, a situation, or a place in need of design intervention, either to solve the problem or to make sense of it. And this is perhaps why it is so rare that problems or situations coming to designers' desk or agendas would not have a design solution. It's so rare that these problems, when they arrive to a design studio or on the desk of designers, will say, okay, this is a problem that a designers almost never will say, this is a problem that does not have a design solution. So this kind of idea, problem or solution, works within this imaginary. And this imaginary helps designers to rework the situation to the degree that it becomes solvable by their design or available for designerly intervention. So you rework the situation to the degree that you find finally a design solution. And that's one of the reasons almost today is that for everything in the world, there is a design solution. And this reworking is shaped by a specific modern design culture, a culture that because of its dominance skips its specific history and geography. And because of such hegemony, important questions are ignored or erased. Questions such as, who has the power to assume holding the knowledge, position, and agency of solving or sense-making? This lack of historical and geographical reflection on the position from which these calls and theorization about design emerge, then spreads over the world through strong academic and cultural institutions, exhibitions, competitions, and publications, as well as venture capitalist framework for innovations by investment in the highly profitable aid and development sector. This is why a historical materialist understanding of design activity as it has arrived today to us, designers and design historians alike, as it practiced commercially and academically, is needed urgently. Historically speaking, the hegemonic modern design we experience today has emerged from the division of labor within the Industrial Revolution in Europe as an aesthetic and intellectual activity of mind that is separated from the labor-intensive activity of handmaking and assembly on factory floors. This division has been part and parcel of class societies, where an emerging middle class could take this new task of designing as opposed to making and assembly, reserved for the working class. This late modern constructed activity and its perceived place in the world as exercised by emerging middle classes who saw and continue to see themselves as creative agents of problem solving, however, does not locate the bodies of those who see, detect, and call out problems to be solved, or in the best case, reward constantly. So you see, what it does is that those people who find problems to be solved and reward problems to be solved disappear from the site. They don't become part of the problem. The imagining of designing as problem solving and value creation is so strong within design education and practice that any other conception of designing beyond this can be easily labeled as art, craft, repair, teach, and so forth and so on. The belief in designing as a force of change and creative problem solving in the world is shared between tech companies, design consultancies, and design academia. While different in their methodologies of implementing design and sometimes quite critical towards each other, nonetheless, all these actors have pushed hard to bring designing and design thinking into policy work, not only within the humanitarian sector, but also in health, transport, unemployment, and so on, under the rise of neoliberal governance and the shrinking of the welfare state. This escalation of designing and design thinking is evident in the prestigious design awards dedicated to humanitarian causes, design programs focusing on humanitarianism, and design agencies developing toolkits for working within their development and humanitarian sectors. Let us take the famous or unfamous example of IDEO, which is one of the major design firms in the world that has succeeded as part of the expansion of the field of interaction design and Silicon Valley's dominance over definitions of what counts as innovation. IDEO has been one of the first major actors in defining design thinking as a necessary approach for companies and organizations in order to tackle the wicked problems they face in their businesses, services, and productions. Design thinking has expanded globally and has also led to new practices such as design management and service design. One of the major methods in design thinking is the use of design toolkits and deck of cards, also developed at IDEO as part of a studio culture specific to design firms in technological sectors at Silicon Valley. These toolkits are often designed as a generalized method, which is what a toolkit stands for, of course, for engaging with solving wicked problems that need a wider understanding of the context. The kit, which is a popular method in design academy and practice, provides designers with quick reflective skills to learn the local culture they work with and to develop sensitivities toward people who might be different from them. Because of this, these kits have found their way easily into the aid sector and are used to understand the need of a consumer group who is regulated by aid organizations and agencies. In his book, Change by Design, Tim Brown, the head of IDEO, has put forward suggestions for the role of designing in solving global problems that are strikingly similar to those suggestions made by the US Manual for Counterinsurgency Troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. In fact, this is not a coincidence. Much of design thinking was developed in the United States, who of course occupied Iraq and Afghanistan, where a flood of American and Western companies and organizations have been active in all possible sectors, from the military and security to education, healthcare, and housing. The entanglement of the cultural and technical work of designing with the logic and practice of the military in asymmetrical wars of the 21st century reminds of the well-established humanitarian militarism nexus. Sorry. Didier Fassin and Mariella Pandolfi, in tracing how humanitarianism intersects with forms of militarism and security, suggest that This seemingly contradictory nexus represents a new paradigm put in place in the 70s and 80s, grounded in the right to intervene, to put sovereignty aside in the name of the moral principle of saving lives. Niels Giertman proposes that another way to understand this overlapping paradigm is to trace how humanitarian technologies are being implemented and deployed in conjunction with the military forces and vice versa. You know, when the same military airplane that drop bombs, they also drop food packages, right? Yet one can argue that is not only the case of implementing humanitarian technologies by military forces, but also how these technologies and design are ontologically inhabiting the same world of the military logic of intervention that is not confined to 70s and 80s, but is part of the long project of civilization by colonial grasping. So the humanitarian militaristic says that in certain places, the state fails. So US and imperial power basically argue and legitimize a military intervention to save lives, right? But at the same time, what happens is that while military forces basically deployed through humanitarian reasons, is that these humanitarian also technologies developed by same ideology is distributed by the military forces. So they go in hand. And what I'm trying to say here is that it's not only about practice, they basically inhabit the same world ontologically, humanitarianism and militarism. So, and as I said, this is not only something about 70s and 80s, but this has a very long history of the long project of civilization by colonial grasping. Victor Papanek's tin can radio, which has been a historical example of how Western designers can help and support humanitarian causes with sensitivity towards local culture and resources in global South countries, was ordered by the US Army during the Cold War. The assumption was that people in rural Southeast Asia countries were illiterate and not aware of national agendas. The device was simply a channel for American propaganda during the Cold War, despite Papanek's different and good intention. A paternalistic design covered by humanitarian coating, those in the ideology of the noble savage, as put by a design critic at the time, Guy Bonspiel. The radio was also criticized by other designers for being ugly, the one on the left side, you can see. The radio also was criticized by other designers for being ugly, and Papanek defended his design with a moral argument, saying he does not have the right to make aesthetic choices for the users and they can decorate it as they wish, as you see on the other side, which was decorated by a farmer in Indonesia. However, the self-claimed right to think that certain groups of people in certain parts of the world need a radio was not apparently part of his moral position. The right to intervene has thus become the principal imaginary of designers for solving problems. In order to solve the problem, designers need to intervene. And in order to intervene, they need an imaginary that makes the work of design meaningful in the context deprived of a good design. And that's the work of humanitarian imaginary. The humanitarian imaginary design. So this first time, the first part, the problem-solving imaginary of design, and I try kind of connect this to the humanitarian imaginary of design. Borrowing Charles Taylor's concept of the social imaginary, which he describes as the ways in which people imagine their social existence how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, and the expectations that are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and images that underlie these expectations. Lisa Smear developed what she calls a humanitarian imaginary. For Smear, a humanitarian imaginary is a shared social imaginary that is formed through specific practices and experiments in specific sites of emergency and disaster, but also is part of an international circulation of values and norms around notions of dignity and the human. She pays particular attention to places, temporality, and objects that together form an imaginary for humanitarian workers, in which their position and work within a constructed global project of humanity makes sense and appear as morally legitimate. For example, she argues that places rendered in need of humanitarian help appear through a certain humanitarian imaginary, but are also reconstructed in the aftermath of disaster in a certain way based on such imaginary. So she says, quote unquote, Lisa Smith, that the reconstruction of a place following a natural disaster is not only, she writes in the context of natural disaster, but you can think about this other types of disaster. Almost, there is no disaster that's natural, you could say today, because of the question of Anthropocene. But so the reconstruction of a place following a disaster is not only of value for those that are the immediate recipients, but also for those that can claim it as an exemplar of humanitarian or social ideal. The contemporary post-crisis setting often provides, she says, an environment where various ideas of ideal society, family, even the ideal individual are proposed, contested, and championed. Places where humanitarian intervention are imperative have become the key site where idealized aspects of design thinking and solutions are introduced and tested. An example has been the Mediterranean Sea and the graveyard it has become for those who transgress the European Union borders. The Mediterranean Sea has not only been a space of border militarization and humanitarian struggle, but also an ideal site for designerly intervention. In 2013, in the aftermath of another round of brutal death of migrants in the Mediterranean, who drifted in the sea for several days, and their call for rescue was ignored by the Italian Coast Guards, an architectural firm designed a solution that proposed a line of saving buoys to be installed in the Mediterranean. In 2015, a mobile phone app was produced that claimed it could help to pinpoint the location of boats in distress at the sea. It won a humanitarian award, but proved to be fake and non-functioning. Furthermore, many startups and hackathons have popped up in European countries to address the problem of refugees, coming up with innovative solutions to the European refugee crisis, as they put it, and so on and so forth. A further tension within the humanitarian imaginary of design is the question of time and temporality, which is embedded in design practice. On the one hand, designers are supposed to find creative solutions. On the one hand, designers are supposed to find creative solutions that are long-lasting. On the other hand, there is a market-driven logic of obsolescence within the design industry that any design thing should be redesigned constantly to generate the most profit of a product, a service, or a system can have. Within such a tension, many designers, especially those concerned with the question of sustainability and resilience, constantly argue that a good design can and should last longer. However, designing as an act of reconfiguring and manipulating materials can never be a long-lasting practice. There is always a limit to any design solutions, and it can be redesigned over and over again, either by the same designers, other designers, or non-designers. These tensions are also apparent in the humanitarian context, a field where the idea of emergencies requiring quick responses is repeatedly romanticized and forms its existence and legitimacy despite the frequent critiques of humanitarian political and historical ignorance. Humanitarian design solutions within the housing sector, or what the sector calls shelters, can be seen as one of the best examples to show that any emergency and its associated humanitarian imaginary can become a permanent condition for the regulation of life and political subjectivity, and more importantly, reproduce the racial hierarchies that are part and parcel of humanitarianism. Design things are sneaky in that sense. They are legitimized as temporary solutions to problems that can later and in use be reworked through participatory processes and ad hocism. This imaginary makes humanitarian design initiated by white Western paradigm of problem solving a permanent part of the life of the racialized poor population. And despite the failure of many of these humanitarian solutions, they are constantly advocated for, praised, funded, deployed, and discarded. This example of one of the most famous shelter in the emergency sector designed by Swedish designers and deployed by IKEA, which constantly redesign and new versions coming out all the time. It's called Better Shelter, and it's one of the products that the designers claim that has the most durable life among its competitors in the humanitarian market, which contradicts this whole idea of these people supposed to just have a home for a short period of time, a shelter for a short period of time, and later supposed to be able to build again or get back to their own country and so on. Yes. Humanitarian designer thus participate in advocating and shaping an imagination that upholds these divisions between different groups of humanity, upholds a racial order of the world, a racial order that was imagined, sustained, and made real by colonialism. The colonial imaginary of humanitarian goods, my final part. The space and time of humanitarian design interventions to solve the problems imagined by both humanitarianism and the design self-claim position in addressing the suffering and vulnerability of the racialized poor population of the world resembles Edward Said's famous formulation of imagined geography. For Said, there is a geographic imaginary at the heart of cultural imperialism, where certain meanings are ascribed to certain places and certain knowledge is produced about them. It is through such imaginations that certain courses of action become possible in relation to a specific place and help certain groups of society to participate in the imagination and production of meanings. Said reminds us that we would not have had an empire itself without the philosophical and imaginative processes for the production as well as the acquisition, subordination, and settlement of a space. This goes for the work of design too, as design things with their aesthetic and physical and performative presence in the world not only persuades us that there existed a problem we did not know about, but also persuade us that they are the best solutions to the problems imagined by designers. As such, design things in the world are derived from certain imaginaries. They reproduce the imagination when they are in use. More than that, they generate new imaginaries about the ones whose needs are served by using those designs. This power of design chart an expansive and global imaginary through its standardized rational, globalized production, and transnational consumption, eased by market capitalism. No wonder there are universal standards for how to design emergency shelters put together by UNHCR and similar transnational organizations. These standards do not come from anywhere. They are the work of design imaginaries about what a human needs and what constitutes a dignified life in a disaster context. As Anibal Coicano has argued in one of the known classic essays of the coloniality modernity project, coloniality is not direct colonial rule, but an imaginary of the capitalist world system established historically by direct colonial rule that continues into the present. The colonial imaginary thus is a construction with real and continuous effects in the world. One of the pillars of this imaginary is the idea of a human, which appears as a universal, but in fact is a particular human, a Western man that emerged during the Renaissance and became the role model of the human during the Enlightenment. While the liberal project of humanity has been the basis of Western philanthropy and humanitarianism, Sylvia Winter teaches us that the human of the humanity project has always been a particular one concerned with Western bourgeois man. As such, any humanitarian project in the name of humanity is always a project of obscuring the racial hierarchy embedded in the production of the universal category of human, to be defended, dignified, saved, and guarded. Thus, the liberal project of humanitarianism and philanthropy was not necessarily a mere project of alleviating the suffering of the enslaved, the poor, the wretched, but an active part of a colonial imaginary where specific places and times were spatialized and temporalized as sites of empty of historical, cultural, or economic value, yet full of potential to become productive. Humanitarian design follows the same ideology as it legitimizes its intervention because of the lack of enough good design in a specific place or context that has a potential for testing new ideas of design. The major new approaches in design, including social innovation, service design, transition design, and the like, have in one way or another the agenda of addressing human rights and dignity, of turning crisis into opportunity, to humanize the migrant, the refugee, the homeless, the poor, and the vulnerable. In such imagination, roles are already prescribed. Some have the capacity and skill to decide, formulate, and solve problems for others. Others need to consume or learn those skills to be able to be responsive to the problems defined by others. Humanitarian design, with its baggage of problem-solving imaginary, and the humanitarian imaginary is part of the colonial imaginary of humanitarian use. It affirms its position within the current socio-economic order as designing for the good of the humanity. Yet it constantly designs goods that make humanity dependent on them to be able to perform the humanity that is imagined for them. I repeat this. So what design does, that it affirms its position within the current socio-economic order as a designing for the good of humanity, yet it constantly designs type of goods that make humanity dependent on them to be able to perform the humanity that is imagined for them. This cruel compassion is a form of ethical imperialism in which the language of reciprocal recognition and reconciliation mask the violent reduction of the alterity of the other to more of the same, to borrow Richard Bernstein's formulation. This is not that different from the moral superiority Europeans created for themselves by identifying and categorizing the rest of the world as subordinate in order to be able to sustain the expansive project of colonialism. When the design imaginary of solving problems is entangled with the question of compassion, the outcome is nothing but a form of humanitarian design, as discussed so far. And when rights and justice are replaced by compassion and distributed through design artifacts and systems, then those in need appear as a group not belonging to any other people, but as a strange group completely dependent upon the compassion of others. And in their naked mere humanity, they create an uncanny impression of something utterly inhuman, as Hannah Arendt wrote on the question of refugees in 1944. Arendt understood the caprice of humanitarian imagination as a structural to the historical and political circumstances of the modern refugees. So for her, humanitarianism appeared because of the context in which refugees are produced. As such, any practice of designing that imagines a universal notion of humanity will never guarantee justice. On the contrary, being a mere human, a category imagined by a specific Western epistemology that renders the person dependent on others' imagination and creativity, is the first step to becoming inhuman. And why does this division always assign the same roles to the same groups of people? On the one side, the good intentions of white people, on the other, the dependency of people of color on these goods for survival. The history of philanthropy and humanitarianism has an answer, that humanitarianism was part of the project of colonial rule through administration of morality that would guarantee the continuation of the profitable economy of colonial machinery. Furthermore, humanitarian design with its concrete and finished or participatory solutions to the suffering of the racially poor population serves tangibly and materially the historical erasure of responsibility, or what the late Charles Mills has called white ignorance. The historical ignorance of design practitioners in how the practice of design came to be, and the ignorance of the politics of the context in which designs are imagined for and applied, results in a white ignorance where designing for or with the racialized and poor population of the world reproduces and reinforces the superior position of benevolent white designers. They don't know, don't want to know, and don't need to know in order to operate within their practice, positions, and imaginary as they are. Many design practitioners and researchers have long been concerned with how their practice can contribute to questions concerning right, equality, and justice. However, the history of design practice shows that many of these concerns and engagements cannot escape the logic of racial capitalism, which has given birth and shape to the practice of design. There is an internal and long-standing tension that needs to be questioned, unsettled, and dismantled. As such, the question of whether any professional design practice operating within the logic of capital and colonialism can ever be a just practice seems impossible. The question of how justice and rights can be enacted through designing should rather be thought about in relation to the everyday life struggles of the vulnerable who have configured their own fragile yet supportive infrastructures of endurance that delink them from a universal object of compassion and humanity and position them as situated subjects practicing politics and demanding justice in their pluralities and differences. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahmoud, for your lovely talk. I think it's given us a lot to think about. Throughout your work, you discuss binaries and whether it's object or non-object, or when we look at how passports are being produced, but simultaneously they're being smuggled. And now finally, with this talk, we also saw the idea of problem solving and the creation of new colonial problems or the sustenance of it. Even in your conclusion of your talk, you have spoken about, I suppose, not solutions, but things to discuss when we look at design, but as well as other disciplines in terms of like history and anthropology. So how do we navigate these hierarchies and these binaries when we're trying to find other spaces and other, and trying to complicate these conversations, when all of these conversations are rooted in Western epistemologies?
Well, I think, it depends. Of course, it's first of all, this is a struggle and it's a collective struggle. And I think it's very hard for many of us, all of us almost, being educated and rooted within this Western epistemological machine to somehow unlearn. And we know that when we say unlearn, it doesn't mean to forget, actually to use what we have learned and kind of locate that and position that within the history that well, this epistemology that has produced this could as well be another type of path, could have taken another path simply, right? So there are these parts that are paths that are unexplored. I think that's one of the things to think about. Much of the work I've tried to do is to question this design self-claim position in addressing the world as problems to be solved. And this goes for commercial and critical. And this is, again, part of this whole Western epistemology of problem solving. While we know that many people in the world, often their everyday struggles, it's not necessarily about problems to be solved to scale up, right, to gain profit. It's the way in which you deal with different complexities of life, right? And you don't find to standardize, you don't find to rationalize. I mean, even though you might face similar problems every day, you don't set up a plan for kind of meeting that problem. So what design does here, does this act of this kind of self-claim position that you can kind of make a plan, a rationalized kind of process of calculating these problems. And of course, it's hard to constantly unlearn these structures of learning. This is the structures of knowing the world, and this is structure of acting in the world. But I would say that this unlearning, it has both sides, because it cannot be just unlearning. It's a matter of also learning other things, right? And I think one of the things we have to work with, and when I say we, it's like, in that context, I mean academics. And, in other contexts, maybe, working with social questions, is to constantly question my own assumptions produced by Western knowledge, right? And one way of that is historicizing, right? What historicizing help us is not, as Nia in the beginning said, it's not about to be able to celebrate achievements. Historicizing in this process of unlearning is all about politicizing the context in which we work, we want to know, we want to relate to. And it's a hard task to do. And that's why it becomes hard for design, because you don't want to deal with these complex histories, right? You're just there to design your thing. So I think the process of unlearning and learning, like understanding what kind of things I have to unlearn for me to open my eyes to learn other things. So it's not about exploring. Things are there in the world. They exist, all these different epistemologies, different ways of living, different ways of making. But we often don't see them because we have learned certain type of eyeglasses to have on. We have learned certain epistemological yardstick that kind of does not capture these other ways of doing, making, and living. So unlearning in order to open up to see this other existing structure. And how to do that? Anyway, on the individual level, I think it's very different. On the collective level, it's to find alliances which cut across geographies and across interests, right? I think it's kind of interesting, this type of kind of thinking and discourses and discussions which were alive in 60s and 70s across different, during the kind of the colonial movement that started. Without internet, we had kind of this strong alliance. And today we have that, and we don't have that type of strong alliances between different groups struggling in different parts of the world. So it's kind of strange, but at the same time not, because the way in which internet's used now is very much entangled with the context in which capitalism wants us to use it and entangle. So in a way, I think one important task beyond the intellectual task is this logistical task of how to connect across these different collectivities that exist and wants to kind of change the discourses around, let's say in this case, design.
Thank you so much. As a founder member of Decolonizing Design, could you tell us a little bit about how it started? How did you make these connections across the world? And you also mentioned Edward Said's Imagined Geography. I'm trying to connect it to how it must have shaped decolonizing design. So yeah, if you could tell us a little bit about it, and what are the kind of conversations that you have amongst this collective?
Well, I mean, to start from the end, I mean, the collective, unfortunately, is not that active now. But when we were, I mean, we have it still, but less active as used to be maybe almost 10 years ago. But it's interesting that you asked this question, because we came together also on the margins of the Western institutions. So one of the things today, you know, someone like Said would say that it's impossible to talk about the other as much as, you know, many, let's say, anthropologists or, you know, philologists and all these people did previously during the colonial expansion, because the other now to a higher degree exists in the academia, right? So the academia is full of more people. The other already is in this space. And the other in the space is, I often try to kind of work or navigate those kind of walls of these institutional hierarchies, and what counts as knowledge, what does not count as knowledge, and so on and so forth. So we all were part of this Western institution, could say, and we met or came across each other's work either through conferences organized by those very dominant Western epistemologic machinery, or, you know, online forums that also, you know, about this Western imagination. So we came together through these places. So again, what I'm trying to say is, on learning and delinking, when we talk about delinking from this, it's not necessarily to kind of reject altogether. This is part of the history. This is part, I mean, this exists. You cannot just ignore it. The question is like how to strategically use and locate and limit that. Let's say, if it was this design conference, how to kind of let not this grow as the only and expansive model for design thinking, but rather limit and kind of provincialize, as Chakrabarty would say, provincialize this specific site and place to its own limits, its own space and time and bodies. So that's one point to kind of make about the collective. We met that way, right? So I know some, and then I met some other people, and then at some point we came together. But I mean, the story, I think we have talked about this story in some interview, I think in the book that's called Design Struggles. There is this anthology that there are different pieces, quite an interesting anthology. And there is an interview with some of us, and we discuss also the process. But to make it short, we felt that our own research, all of what we do in so one way or another, question certain assumption within Western thinking of design. And we wrote a piece together, which was like rejected by a conference. And then that became an opportunity in which to speak back to the colonizer, you would say. And that kind of where things took off. And thinking, producing a space in which other people can feel comfortable and so on. So that's how the group kind of came together. But we work, I mean, we are from a different backgrounds, different class, gender, and ethnicity background, and we occupy very different positions in our home country and occupy very different positions in the places we live. Nonetheless, we are not as heterogeneous as you might think. There are also similarities. So the group is limited in its own scope. And also that's why we're less active maybe now, you could say, because I think the group, I mean, when we started this whole thing, there were some voices here and there, and it was not as organized. Now you know that it's quite big in design. And I think we're happy for that. And we think that as a group, we would kind of do some things when we have something new to say. As a group, I would say. Otherwise, individually, everyone does their own thing, basically, which kind of resembles across these lines of design and politics and question of coloniality.
Thank you. Before I get to the audience questions, I have two last questions on my end. So I wanted to know about your current work. Could you tell us a little bit about it? And in your previous work on passports, you do talk about the politics of design and the design of politics, which has influenced this confidence in a great deal. So have your notions of the politics of design and the design of politics changed? And how has it influenced your current work?
No, I would not say that it's changed that notion that exists. I mean, that kind of work, both as a theory but also as a methodology, it's kind of underlying much of my later project. And I mean, this project that I work is kind of, I'm wrapping it up and I'm starting another kind of project, and design politics very present there. It's also on borders and so on. What I would say in the framing that I'm kind of adding now, it's what we often now today people talk about design anthropology, and what I want to kind of include to push that. The commercial aspect of design anthropology, or the critical one, the fact that you just include people in your design as a participator, it doesn't make it design anthropology. So I'm interested to, I'm what kind of one thing that I think the design politics framework like missed, even though it was in the book, this was this question of how to identify moments and situations in which you can work with the design politics. I mean, I made that argument that methodologically speaking, there are situations and moments in which design politics can be seen more clearly, and the entanglement of design politics, for example, in the case of passport, and there are moments and situations in which that kind of interventions or reworking of design politics that people already do can be identified and kind of discussed. And the kind of the work I do is very much about how as a privileged person, we would develop a form of kind of epistemology in which we can kind of help us to identify, rather than saying, where are the places I can design? Let's say, where are the places in which people kind of configure their own ways of doing things? So in a way, it's kind of recognizing the politics of who and whose hand that make things. It's kind of the type of work I do. And yeah, I would say the question of design politics exists. It has not changed, because it's always about these two things, right? The design of politics, it's, how values, norms, ideologies cannot exist, cannot be accepted, cannot be legitimized without material practices. Because what material practice do is that help us by consuming and repetitively using them, forget that these are specific ideologies, these are specific norms, these are specific, this kind of magic that also I talked about. Those ideology, norms, histories kind of disappears. Even a simple design, you need a historian to kind of dig a history for that thing. As a consumer, you don't know, what's the history of these things, whose labor, what materials, from where, what kind of things it was extracted, who are the people who kind of discard this, who takes care of it. We just use it and are concerned with the user-friendly aspect of it. So there is this, design of politics, that kind of obscure the whole politics into that material thing, the whole history into that material thing, which they have to kind of almost, I use the Stuart Hall notion of disarticulating, right? But also there is this politics of design, which refers to much of this imaginary, this type of cultures that gets less discussed, the institutions, the education, all those kind of politics that locate certain things as design and other things not as design, promote certain designs and not other types of designs. Who is the designer? Who is not the designer? All those discussions. Is this art or design? Is this craft or design? Is this just, making and design? All this kind of thing that even, many critical scholars still can have this kind of division. So that's the political option. And I think these are still very present in my work, and I hope that it was present in my presentation. But yeah.
Okay. Would you see yourself as a design historian? much of this conference was trying to understand where is design history now, and is it still relevant? As things become more interdisciplinary, where does a niche discipline like design history or design study stand? And I think you've already spoken about what it should do and what it can do, but where do you see yourself in this discourse?
Well, I mean, I never seen myself as a design historian, and I'm not a trained historian either. But partly, I mean, I've seen myself, my work very much in the intersection of design studies and cultural anthropology. And I mean, the work I do, I would say, you know, in a way, trying kind of a bit to push also the boundaries, the institutional boundaries of what define design history as, you know, the kind of a version of art history. I mean, also, as Nia said, I'm not, you know, I'm not concerned with the individuals called designers, because even though design history tell us there is no design that was individually made. So I'm concerned with the practices, right? In that sense, you know, I of course take inspiration from a Foucaultian approach, right? It's for me, I'm interested in situations, in moments in which certain meaning kind of gets registered as a normative meaning. And those situations, what kind of materialities are at hand, what kind of relations, what kind of histories. So in the passport, yeah, passport is one thing, but all these technologies that is in the passport, you know, in certain moments they come together, you know, and form this kind of material. They are this object, right? You know, the biometric, the fingerprinting, all these things have their own histories and own legitimization before they arrive to passport. So there are type of designs that they legitimize themselves somewhere, and then when they are kind of bundled together into a new product called passport, then you don't question them anymore, right? And what for me, from both the work of, let's say, from a perspective of anthropology, is how people affected by these things experience the world, how they relate to the world, how they make their life possible despite all these kind of things, and kind of the design perspective, how kind of these makings produce meaning in the world. These two I put together, then for me, you know, of course, I go beyond the chronological kind of, I mean, I'm not saying that's bad. There are benefits to that way of organizing history or analyzing history, but we all know that way of organizing history you know, it misses many points in the history, the situation, the moments, the type of archives we want to look at, right? So I did a work about this was about the Swedish, like the Scandinavian craft, which has in the design history and craft history kind of context, has a very distinct aesthetics and definitions, and who are the individuals or organization behind Scandinavian craft or Swedish craft. And with my colleague Christina Zetterlund, we did a work based, because during the work I did on passport, I came across archive at the police station, which was list of people who were deported from Sweden, like in 20s and 30s, and many of these people were designers and makers and so on. And one of the arguments we make in that piece is that, you know, to understand the history of Swedish craft, it's not enough just to look at the collections and the archives that exist, you know, in museums or art school, or, you know, even the radical alternative craft movement. We need to look at police archive. We need to look at how the archive of migration and deportation from this country, because if these people were not deported, they could have been part of making the craft look completely different. So that the Scandinavian, that Swedish craft we see today, it's made possible because certain makings were excluded in that process. And one way of looking at this is to historically looking for these makers who would disappear, right, from this history, but also from contributing. They were living here, but they were deported. Roma people, the travelers, you know, Russian Jews, and so on, many of these groups. So for me, history is very much about these experiences that they get lost. And for me, then methodologically is very much to look at those moments, or as I said, situations, historical situations in which bodies we often don't see, practices we often don't see as we are trained, can come up and kind of contribute to something else, can teach us one thing or two about what design could be, what craft could be, what making could be.
We have a couple of questions from the audience. I'm going to start with Adarsh's question. I think it responds quite well to what you just said. So much of design education, especially as it pertains to practice, presuppose an action of any sort, like an end goal. But listening to your talk, I see that there are myriad ways, which is not just the solutions, but the very substance of design problems are and always will be bound by an almost always deficient imagination. Thus, I see abstinence as the only solution. If so, how do we begin to teach abstinence as a practice?
Wow, I love the question. Yeah, this is a very nice way of putting it, and I don't have any answer to that because this is they have to think about. To be honest, I would love to talk about this more. I mean, that question of how to teach abstinence as a practice, if 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 that's possible. And I think I have to make just one kind of comment on that. That we have to remember that there is a difference between, I'll just take notes here. There is a difference I think one thing that's, amnesia, right? So because abstinence can also at some point lead to what you could say amnesia. And that's what, what also part of this machinery don't want us to see certain. So the point is not to not imagine, right? The point is not that to kind of get rid of imagination, but simply to constantly think and reflect, what does this imagination come from? How I imagine this person in need of help, why I imagine this person in need of help in this way. So it's not about getting rid of that. Actually, what we need is more imagination. The problem we have today is that our imagination is so limited, have become constrained by very certain ways of doing things. So in a way, I'm not advocating for not having imagination. As I said, I advocate for having more plural imaginations. Like the plurality in imagination is the way to go, right? Because the people in different contexts, they always imagine both themselves, where they are, where they want to be, how I mean, imagination is the way you could see, the politics we talk about. It's all about this struggle over imaginations, right? Whose imaginations get to be registered as the imaginations to get realized, to be tangible through the work of design, through the other work of planning and so on. So there is a specific imagination that gets realized and made tangible. So to struggle over these imaginations, we need other imagination, to counter, to come up against this dominant imagination. So I would say we need rather a type of teaching that teach us the design, even though we think our teaching in design is very imaginative. But as I tried to show, this imagination is very much limited. So thinking about how we can teach courses in design that promote imaginations beyond this limited brief of design education that promotes very specific type of imagination. I hope that was answered.
We have another question by Medes. While I understand some points in the lecture, well, I didn't understand some points in the lecture. What the speaker is suggesting seems to be leaning towards a degrowth perspective in terms of design as a given. And AI has been influencing design forever. Um, if primarily, if we're trying to understand life's complexities and how design doesn't aid growth in the long run, like for example, the person who's asking the question mentions COVID. Isn't it better to let designers by encouraging tinkering, like in software, which helps reduce suffering by inviting people to notice the incompletedness rather than being resigned to drawing guidelines and safety measures first, which would, in the long run, hinder growth?
Well, yeah, I mean, these approaches to designing that, you know, some people call it design after design, right? Promote a type of design that open, like you design something and just by being, as you say, incomplete, it would kind of invites people to work on it and make it better fit to their life. And this is something, you know, we could say in one level, it's interesting, you know, it's an interesting thought experiment, and some designers have worked with this. My question would be rather, I mean, that's yeah, sure, that's very good. But again, what I'm trying here to raise question about, what epistemological framework we have at hand available to us, let's say, to make me think about this context needs an incomplete design, right? Like what kind of politics out there and said, okay, now you can design a shelter, but just to be sensitive, you don't design a complete shelter. You let it be. Because I mean, any design, even the most complete, I mean, you buy an iPhone, you still put, you know, something, you try make it the Papa neck thing, you know, you decorate it. There is some level of remaking and appropriation in all design works, right? Some of them less structural and some of them more structural, but the point I want to raise again is not like, oh, all design have problem. I try to point to a structural thing that we learn in our design education. I mean, generally in the Western world, but it's also, you know, my home country is Iran, and I learned all these things, many of these Western things there, right? So, and the thing is that, so what kind of politics at work that signal to me, oh, do the intervention here. This place needs your even, let's say, incomplete design intervention, but let people do it. What kind of, just be aware of that and be reflecting over that. Who has made that call for me to that intervention? It's only me, and how that me came to that idea of making intervention. So these are like the things I'm trying kind of to kind of point towards. Yeah.
We have one last question. I guess it connects to this idea of incompletedness or remaking. The question is from Arjun. It says, during the Cold War, the former Warsaw Pact countries had a distinctly different approach to design. Would love to hear your insight into this. Yeah.
Well, Lauren, this is a good question. I'm not, as I said, design historian, so I don't have that much good knowledge of the specificities of Warsaw Pact kind of design aesthetics, norms, or thinking. If someone else expert on this would do that, but I have a colleague, or had a colleague, Tom Kubin, who wrote about this specific studio in Moscow, in Russia, about the form of critical design that they worked with. And my little knowledge about, you know, the type of design in the Soviet Union and the countries that were part of the economic pact, in a way points me, I mean, it of course, it was another imagination, you could say, of the way in which, let's say, certain values would kind of get prioritized over other values. And for me, this just points out to the possibilities of that you can do still. I mean, you can work with the materiality of the world in many, many, many different ways. Right? There is this possibility of reconfigurations, as Clive Dillons never gets tired of making that point, the design studies scholar, design historian, that these reconfigurations. So what we see, what we witness now, we have just, I mean, dominantly got just one reconfiguration. We have got some reconfiguration, let's say in Latin America, in Chile, and in Soviet Union, with their own limits and problems. So I'm not in that position to kind of do the comparative task of type of design here, but for me, these things were just an kind of an example of how labor's materialities, relationship in societies can be formed in a sense that could be maybe less extractive. Nonetheless, that I think the type of humanity imagined in the work of Soviet design, it's also problematic in that sense of that, you know, universal human projects. A different human, it's a different human, but there is a universal human in that project too, which I find it problematic.
I'm gonna jump in, unfortunately, and we're sort of wrapping up time, but I just really want to close with a very sincere thank you to Mahmoud today for sharing his work. I think this has been a really meaningful way to close the series. So thank you very much. And I also want to say a big thank you to Phantom Hands for their support for the series, and BIC, to Raghu, Lekha, and Sandhya for all of their support putting this together as well, and to Rukmini and Adarsh for their support on this series too. So thank you. Many of the talks are online on the BIC YouTube channel. And so if you would like, anybody that's here today would like to revisit some of the talks, you can head to the BIC channel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Nia. Well, thank you.
Good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Ash. Bye.